became a major issue. As the central government weakened, officials in the provinces started to abuse their power. They would overtax the people and keep the money for themselves. Important government jobs were no longer given to the most talented people. Instead, they were often sold to the highest bidder. This meant that the administration of the empire became less efficient and less fair. The legal system that Suleiman had worked so hard to build began to fall apart. This caused unrest among the people and made the empire harder to govern effectively. The military, once the empire's greatest strength, also began to weaken. The Janissaries, those elite soldiers, became too powerful. They started to interfere in politics, demanding more pay and even overthrowing sultans they didn't like. They also resisted change. When European armies were modernizing with new tactics and better weapons, the Janissaries refused to adopt these new methods. They were stuck in the past. A crucial turning point was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, a huge naval battle where a European fleet defeated the Ottoman navy. Although the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet, it showed that they were no longer invincible. Another major blow came from the economy. The Ottomans had grown rich by controlling the trade routes to the east. But now, European explorers like Vasco da Gama had found a new way to Asia by sailing around Africa. This meant they no longer had to go through Ottoman lands and pay Ottoman taxes. This discovery of new sea routes diverted a lot of trade and money away from the empire. At the same time, a flood of cheap silver from the Americas caused massive inflation. Prices went up, the currency lost its value, and the Ottoman economy began to suffer badly. These cracks would only grow wider over the next few centuries. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman Empire was in serious trouble. European powers, which had once feared the Ottomans, now saw them as weak and backward. They started calling the empire the sick man of Europe. This was a cruel nickname, but it was also quite accurate. The empire was losing territory, its economy was failing, and it was struggling to keep up with the Industrial Revolution that was transforming Europe. While European nations were building factories and modern armies, the Ottoman Empire was falling further and further behind. It was a slow and painful decline. The empire lost a lot of land during this period. Powerful neighbors, especially Russia and Austria, were constantly nibbling away at its borders. There were many wars, and the Ottomans lost most of them. Greece fought for and won its independence in the 1820s. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria also broke away to form their own countries. Nationalistic ideas, which were spreading across Europe, were now inspiring the different ethnic groups within the empire to demand their own independent nations. The old millet system, which had once been a strength, was now helping to fuel these nationalist movements. The empire was slowly being pulled apart from within. Some sultans realized that things had to change. They tried to reform the empire to make it more modern. This period of reform in the 19th century is known as the Tanzimat, which means reorganization. Sultans like Mahmud II and Abdulmecid I tried to create a modern army, a new bureaucracy, and a more equal society. Mahmud II famously and brutally disbanded the Janissaries in 1826 because they were blocking all his attempts at military reform. The Tanzimat reforms also introduced new laws that gave non-Muslims more rights and aimed to create a common Ottoman citizenship for everyone. But these reforms were often too little, too late. They were expensive and were resisted by many powerful groups inside the empire who didn't want to lose their old privileges. The empire had to borrow huge amounts of money from European banks to pay for the reforms and its wars. By the 1870s, the Ottoman government was bankrupt and couldn't pay its debts. This gave European powers even more control over the empire's finances. The sick man was now not just weak, but also deeply in debt to the very countries that were taking its territory. The end was drawing near. The final blow to the Ottoman Empire came with the First World War. The empire made the fateful decision to join the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. This turned out to be a complete disaster. The Ottoman armies fought on several fronts, from the deserts of the Middle East to the Caucasus Mountains. They suffered terrible defeats and huge losses. The war put an unbearable strain on the already weak empire. During the war, the government also carried out the horrific Armenian genocide, killing an estimated 1.5 million Armenians, a dark and tragic chapter in the empire's final years. When the war ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was on the losing side. It was completely defeated and broken. The victorious Allied powers, Britain, France, and Italy, occupied Istanbul and carved up the rest of the empire's lands for themselves. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, was incredibly harsh. It left the Ottomans with only a small piece of land in Anatolia. It seemed like the empire that had once terrified Europe would be completely erased from the map. The Sultan was now just a puppet with no real power. But this was not the end of the story. A new leader emerged from the chaos. His name was Mustafa Kemal. He was a brilliant and charismatic army officer who had been a hero during the war. He refused to accept the treaty and the foreign occupation of his homeland. He organized a Turkish nationalist movement and led a war of independence against the occupying powers. From 1919 to 1922, he and his forces fought bravely and managed to drive the foreign armies out of Anatolia. He became a national hero, the savior of the Turkish nation. With victory secured, Mustafa Kemal made a series of radical changes. His goal was to create a new, modern, and secular country from the ashes of the old empire. In 1922, he officially abolished the Sultanate, ending over 600 years of Ottoman rule. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, was forced to flee the country. A year later in 1923, the Republic of Turkey was officially declared, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. He was given the name Ataturk, which means Father of the Turks. The long and incredible story of the Ottoman Empire was over. A new chapter, the story of modern Turkey, had begun.